Be sure to check out MythVisionPodcast.com. Help MythVision grow, guys. Become a Patreon member. You guys will get early access to all my videos when I'm done editing them. Also, it's a small community where you guys can message me your questions and talk to me in private. You guys can also donate through PayPal and Cash App. Join the social media links down in the description. We have Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Help the community of MythVision grow. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you guys are notified every time I do a live video and you don't miss any of my content. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Today, we have Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. He's going to be talking about Mark and Luke, some of the Gospels. Are they imitating Greek literature? More like Greek epics. You guys are definitely going to want to stay tuned to this because I myself am a skeptic, as you guys are probably. And you might be asking yourself, why would a Jewish gospel writer be using Greek literature? But this ties into our previous show. So if you haven't seen the previous show and understanding why this is important, the Q plus Papias hypothesis and the development of these gospels, and was there a lost gospel? You guys definitely need to go check out that episode. We're going to be mainly focusing on mythologizing Jesus, okay? But Dr. MacDonald, and I'm going to start calling him Dennis. He told me I can call him Dennis. I'm very respectful of people with credential. So, Dennis, if you don't mind, can we do a recap on the previous episode, what we did, what we delved into, and your hypothesis here, and then we'll move into this episode.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. Last time we talked about the synoptic problem, and I want to talk about what we call the status questiones, that is the status of the issue. Most scholars hold, and for good reason, Markan priority of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark is the earliest, but there's a huge dispute about Matthew-Luke overlaps. People argue that among the many people who had written before Luke, which he mentions in the preface, is the Gospel of Matthew in addition to Mark. That's the so-called Farr hypothesis, and its major advocate today, Mark Goodacre, and I apparently are going to be talking about this sometime at the beginning of the year. Other people say, no, Luke did not know Matthew. So the extensive overlaps between Luke and Matthew, when they're not dependent on Mark, must come from a common source. This two-document hypothesis then creates a cue, or from the German word Quelle, by looking at alternating primitivity. Sometimes Matthew is more primitive, sometimes Luke is. And it's a very sophisticated and, for its time, revolutionary way of understanding the synoptic problem. Both the Farr hypothesis and the two-document hypothesis, however, have problems. And my own solution, the Q plus Papias hypothesis, argues the following. Yes, to the Farr hypothesis, Luke knew Matthew. But Luke has so much reversed priority to Matthew that he cannot be generating his account from Matthew or Mark alone. He knows something else. So the two-document hypothesis errs in saying that Luke doesn't know Matthew, but it's right in claiming that there's a lost gospel. Instead of using alternating primitivity, I use reversed primitivity or reverse priority. Anytime that Matthew seems to be more primitive than Mark, or Luke seems to be more primitive than Mark and Matthew, I think qualifies for consideration in the lost gospel. Now, Papias is important because he's the earliest commentator we have about the synoptic gospels, and he knows three gospels, but they don't include Luke or John. They include one gospel of Mark and two Greek Gospels of Matthew, but one is lost. And by using reverse priority, we get a Q that is larger than traditional Q, which I call Q plus, or is actually called Q plus. I prefer to call it the Logoi of Jesus, which most likely is its original title. So when one collects these passages that have reverse priority, we get a interesting corpus of really scores of logia. By using what I call social identity criticism, we can see that these form a coherent sociological statement about who Jesus is, about who the in-group is, about who the out-group is. And the out-group includes, especially, Pharisees and authorities on the law that employ the law in a way that's harmful to people, but also to Gentiles and Samaritans who are excluded from the mission of Jesus according to the end of the book. When one assembles these logia into what likely is their most original order, we can use mimesis criticism. Namely, it's an imitation of the book of Deuteronomy in order to portray Jesus as the prophet like Moses. And it corresponds to something that appears in the inaugural sermon. The law and the prophets were the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God has an ethical orientation to Jewish law that is more compassionate. And so Jesus is now the prophet like Moses, who presents a more compassionate understanding of the law. Now, some of this appears also in the canonical Gospels, but not with its density and not with its urgency. So that's what we talked about last time. As a way of making a segue, I'm going to ask you to look in Mythologizing Jesus to page 6. And on page 6, I have a list of the criteria for mimesis criticism. And you'll notice that number 7 is there as well, but there's a paragraph that divides it.
Yes,
So
sir.
what I'd like to do is a kind of stereo reading of it. I want you to read criterion 1 and stop, then criterion 2 and stop, and I'll apply it to how it works with the Logoi of Jesus and Deuteronomy. And then we'll use the same methodology on the Gospel of Mark and Homer. So if you'd read number 1.
The criterion of accessibility pertains to the likelihood that the author of the later text had access to the putative model.
There can be no doubt that the author of the Logoi of Jesus had access to the book of Deuteronomy. We have more fragments of the book of Deuteronomy, for example, among the Dead Sea Scrolls than any book other than the Psalter. And in fact, the author quotes from Deuteronomy several times, 6 times, I believe. So yes, it's accessible. Okay, analogy, number 2.
Analogy likewise pertains to the popularity of the target. It seeks to know if other authors imitated the same proposed literary model.
Scholars of the Hebrew Bible have routinely or often found imitations of Deuteronomy. A good example is the Temple Scroll. We also have the Testament of Moses. We have, and even the text of Deuteronomy shifts in its transmission. So it was a target for rewriting. Number 3.
Density. Simply stated, the more parallels one can posit between 2 texts, the stronger the case that they issue from a literary connection.
Go ahead and read density and distinctive trait too.
The criterion of order, you talking about number
Order,
4?
yeah, order, yeah.
Okay. The criterion of order examines the relative sequencing of similarities in the two works. If parallels appear in the same order, the case strengthens for a genetic connection.
And the go ahead and read the next one. Distinctive traits.
A distinctive trait is anything unusual in both the targeted model and the proposed borrower that links the two into a special relationship.
The density, order, and distinctiveness of the parallels is transparent. It begins, the logo of Jesus begins with John the Baptist in the wilderness preaching repentance to Israel. The book of Deuteronomy begins with, these are the words that Moses spoke to Israel while in the wilderness. The logo of Jesus ends with the promise of thrones to the 12 disciples, saying, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, Deuteronomy ends with promises of what's going to be in the promised land and the division of the tribes by judgeships. We find controversies over Jewish law, references to Moses. The density and distinctiveness and even sequence of this material is really quite striking. So there can't be really any doubt, and I don't know that other people doubt it, that the author is saturated with Deuteronomy, and in my view, he's imitating it. So the next one.
I was just going to comment on that real quick and just say, I think most of these scholars would definitely say, yeah, for sure, Deuteronomy. Where they're going to have the problem is when you start bringing up other sources. And then I love how they tiptoe. We'll talk about some of the tiptoeing that they do, I think, as the show continues and the series continues.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yes, sir. Interpretability assesses what, if anything, might be gained by viewing one text as a debtor to another. As often as not, ancient authors emulated their antecedents to rival them, whether in style, philosophical adequacy, persuasiveness, or religious perspective.
In the case of the Lost Gospel, by rewriting Deuteronomy, you portray Jesus as the prophet like Moses. Yeah.
And often they make him look better, which you're going to show it's not just with Moses. This is, and it's not just with the Hebrew scriptures. This is what they do in general. And I want to ask a question, but we need to get through this because we got to put a needle in this question that I know you're going to deal with. Is we're living in a Hellenized world. We're living in a world that is unique, and it's not like they were completely separated from those around them, the same way that it seems portrayed to remain wholly separated from, the nations that you're around and whatnot and their gods. They're like eating and breathing the same air, if you will. They're eating the same around each other somewhat. And it's like there's a big issue with culture. So anyway, rambling here. Did you want me to hit number 7? Okay. Often Greek readers prior to 1000 CE were aware of affinities between New Testament narratives and their putative classical Greek models, such as ancient and Byzantine recognitions often suggest imitations in the original composition of the Gospels.
Now let's go back, though, to Deuteronomy. Matthew, for sure, saw similarities between what he saw in the Lost Gospel and Deuteronomy. We have 6 antitheses in the inaugural sermon where he says, you have heard it said of old. And then you have a quotation from Deuteronomy or Leviticus. But I say to you, and then it's a quotation from the Lost Gospel. So the author of Matthew clearly saw a tension between the Jewish law as articulated in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and what he saw in the Lost Gospel. So, but That's all we need to do, I think, with Deuteronomy. But I wanted to introduce these criteria for mimesis criticism. But I was going to talk about the popularity of Homer and so on in the Greek world. But this would be a good segue to do it now.
Absolutely.
We have a huge collection of literary papyri from Egypt from the time around 200 BCE to 200 CE, center of Judaism and later of the early church, although it wasn't the dominant one. If one were to tally the numbers in this collection of fragments, we would have 5 fragments from the Septuagint, 5 fragments from the Jewish Bible. We have almost 800 from Homer. 800. If people knew how to read Greek, it's almost certain they had to be exposed to the Homeric Epics, especially the Iliad, about which we'll have more to say. So Homer was everywhere. As Hegel put it, Homer is the oxygen that Greeks breathed. And that's true for Jews. It's true for early Christians. You can see this in the writings of Philo and Josephus. And there are Jewish imitations of Homer and Euripides that we may be able to talk about at some point. But those numbers are astonishing. 5 fragments of the Septuagint and 800 just of Homer. So this is, I take that very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that would play a significant role, especially if, and I always ask this question to people, you know, we can argue over if there was a really original Hebrew Matthew, because that's one of the issues that I think can be addressed while we're in this vein of the Papias claim. Papias claimed there was an original Hebrew of Matthew, but and you don't agree with that. We have no evidence of this. We have no evidence of a Hebrew written New Testament book. And I'm not saying there aren't phrases that are borrowed from Aramaic or something that are clearly indicative of that idea. The point I'm making is you got all these people writing in Greek, especially like a very well written Greek, Luke and such. You have to pretend that they don't have these stories influencing them. Not just that they read them, but that they influenced them and they had a deep impact on them. I don't know about you, but that's how it is even in America. And when we're taught certain things in our society and how our history is, and we think of George Washington or we think of our presidents and things, something that is a very well-known historical fact or something that's an important piece of literature in America, it has a deep meaning to us. And so oftentimes I can see that playing a part in what we're trying to do. But what you're establishing is that the authors who are writing this in Greek aren't just, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't just, I know about this. You're building a genetic connection in this case. And that's what I think is most potent, but also why other scholars are cautious. They don't tread on the waters that you do. And that's what makes you unique. And that's why I'm happy to interview you.
Well, in fact, in the next session we're going to focus precisely on objections to mimesis criticism. But I think, first of all, we ought to say what it is before we jump into the criticisms more. Let me turn to the Gospel of Mark. By using social identity criticism, we can say certain things about the Gospel of Mark, whether he knew the logoi of Jesus or Homeric epic or not. We know that he's writing after the Jewish war, and it's extremely painful for him. He understands the Jewish war in part to be a result of God's punishment on Israel for not accepting Jesus and his followers. He His Jesus is a suffering Jesus in a way more than in the logoi of Jesus. And in fact, he becomes the prototypical martyr. The in-group for Mark, that is his audience, are those who are willing to bear their own crosses and to suffer with, so that the primary thrones that are preserved for the hereafter are preserved for martyrs, those that can drink Jesus's cup. He also is in lament that the temple has been destroyed, but understands it as God's punishment through Rome for Israel's disobedience. I think we can say that no matter what his literary antecedents were. Now, if he knew the logoi of Jesus, and I'm going to not try to make that case terribly strong right now, I've made it elsewhere in time, from the logoi of Jesus to the Gospel of Mark, he would have taken objection to the following things. First, Jesus prohibits a mission to the Gentiles and to the Samaritans. Mark is insistent that the end will not come until all the nations have the good news preached to them. So he's going to have a problem with the logo of Jesus at that point. And in my opinion, his story of the Syrophoenician woman who's a Gentile, a Greek, who has a demon-possessed daughter, in other words, about as socially marginal as you can get, is the one whom Jesus exercises, her daughter Jesus exercises. So it shows how open Jesus is to the outsider. He's also going to take exception to what seems to have been the case in the logo of Jesus, that Jesus says, I will destroy this temple and build another. Because the temple's been destroyed, Jesus didn't do it. Jesus certainly didn't build another. And so in Mark, it's his opponents at his trial say, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple and build another in 3 days, which the 3 days is probably an indication that it's intended to mean his resurrection, something like that. He also doesn't like it that Jesus promises 12 thrones to the disciples. In Mark, the disciples are nincompoops. They never get his project of suffering. And his family is not considered positive either. Those who do the will of God are Jesus's family. So when James and John want to sit at Jesus's right and left hand in glory, that is, on thrones, Jesus says, it's not mine to give. It's preserved for martyrs, those who can drink my cup. So Mark has a reason for opposing certain aspects of the logoi of Jesus. But there's another really important piece of this, Derek, that I think people don't quite understand. Mark is going to write a very different book from the logoi of Jesus, and it's going to focus on Jesus's death in Jerusalem at the hands of chief priests. Chief priests are never mentioned in the logoi of Jesus. There's no narrative of Jesus's death or resurrection, only an exaltation in the logoi of Jesus. So why is Mark going so far out of his way to portray Jesus's martyrdom? And his martyrdom is an anticipation of the fall of Jerusalem. So that once Jesus is killed, the veil of the temple is ripped open, God leaves the temple, and therefore it's vulnerable to destruction. As long as God's in the temple, God will protect it. This is a part of ancient military strategy in antiquity. Now, when Mark goes about writing his passion narrative, there is one literary model that jumps off the page. And that is the most famous story about the destruction of an ancient city, the Iliad by Homer. And the end of the Iliad is about the death and burial of Hector, the city's defender. So once Hector is killed by Achilles, the reader knows that Troy is going to fall. Now, when Virgil in the Aeneid writes his Aeneid about the fall of the Italian dynasty so that Rome can take over, it ends with the death of Turnus, the Rutilian, and Turnus's death is modeled clearly after the death of Hector. Now, whether Mark knows the story in Latin in the Aeneid or not, the Iliad is a perfect example of the relationship of a dead hero and the fall of a city that Mark exploits magnificently in order to express his own sorrow and the tragedy of the fall of Jerusalem. And I think the best way to handle this, Derek, for your audience, is for me to give a summary of the death of Hector and his burial. And because I'm sure that most of your viewers have not read the Iliad in the last 6 months.
I don't know. I got a couple guys I could name, but most will not have read it. Yes, sir.
Okay. And for the purposes of what we're going to be doing, I actually think it's pretty useful. And in order to make it economical, I'm going to look at some notes I've written for myself in walking through this. But let me just say what we've done so far. We've given a recap of the synoptic problem, my hypothesis about the logoi of Jesus, and as a rewriting of Deuteronomy. And we use social identity criticism and mimesis criticism to defend it. Use mimesis criticism, as we'll see, on Mark and Homer, very same criteria, and talked about Mark's social location being different from that of the logoi of Jesus, and it helps to explain why it's such a different book. But now we're going to see that his concern about the fall of the temple and the death of Jesus picks up themes that appear in the Iliad. Right?
That sounds like a wonderful, wonderful idea. Yes, sir. I'm excited.
The Iliad is a story of the siege of Troy for 10 years by the Achaeans because Menelaus wants to win back his wife Helen from the arms and bed of Paris. Achilles is angry with Agamemnon and refuses to fight for much of the war. But the Achaeans cannot take Troy without Achilles' might. So finally, he re-enters the war, and book 22 has a face-off between Achilles and Hector, in which Achilles destroys Hector and anticipates then the destruction of Troy. When Hector says goodbye to his family in book 6, his mother offers him wine to ease his pain. And Hector refuses it because he doesn't want his senses to be blunted, and goes back out to fight, and he never sees his family again. So that's the farewell. When Achilles comes back into the battle, single-handedly, he fights against the Trojan army and sends them all back into the city for refuge, all but Hector. Hector decides his gods, Zeus and Apollo, are going to come to his assistance once again and give him victory over Achilles. So he gets locked outside the city, mano y mano, and has to fight against Achilles, and then sees his might and is afraid. And so he starts to run around the city. Athena, who supports the Achaeans and Achilles, changes her disguise, her appearance, into that of Hector's brother Deiphobus. And she appears to him and says, "Hey, brother, let's both take this guy on. We can take him." So Hector and Achilles trade taunts, and Hector's spear misses. He turns to Deiphobus for another spear, and she's vanished. There's no Deiphobus there. And he says, "Alas, now I know my gods have abandoned me." Even so, he turns and he fights against Achilles. They trade taunts, and he dies with his spirit going off into the ether, off to Hades. Achilles keeps the body and tries to mutilate it by dragging it around horses, behind his horse-drawn chariot, while three women raise the laments from the walls of Troy, watching in horror. It's his wife Andromache, his mother Hecuba, and his sister-in-law Helen. Zeus comes to Priam and says, "I'll send Hermes to protect you if you want to go ransom the body of your son." And so Priam puts together an enormous ransom, dares to go under nightfall into the camp of his enemies with this order to. Reluctantly, Achilles agrees and tells his maidservants to wash and anoint the body and to shroud it. And he himself lifts it onto the chariot. And Priam goes home, and Hector gets a funeral. But it's not bitter, not only because Hector is dead, but because the city's going to fall. And this story became prototypical of the death of a hero and potentially the death of the city. Now, I'll let you ask a question of it if that's not clear, but the next thing I want to do is to read from Mythologizing Jesus, page 122. And so we'll do what I call a stereo reading. I'll read the Homer section, and you'll read its equivalent in Mark.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't really have any questions. Was fantastically put. That really paints a great picture. And I just think it's worth mentioning for those who are like me, who didn't catch it earlier. If you look at the Logoi writing, the lost gospel he's talking about, and then you look at Mark, you'll see that this significant role of a passion narrative wasn't in the Logoi. And so whoever Mark is and whoever's this author may be using this archetype of a narrative that's definitely well known in the Greek world. It was like, you have to know this, that everyone and their kid knew this story. And he's using this as a template, if you will. So
yeah, that's very good. That's right. Now, so I'll be the voice of Homer, and Derek's going to be the voice of Mark. Hector, Apollo's favorite, had long eluded death.
Jesus, God's son, had eluded death. This is Mark 15.
Hector's troops fled into the city for safety, leaving him to face his fate alone.
Jesus' disciples fled for safety, leaving him to face his fate alone.
Zeus passed judgment, Hector must die.
Pilate passed judgment. Jesus must die.
Hector had refused mixed wine offered him to relieve his pain.
Jesus refused mixed wine offered him to relieve his pain.
Achilles and Hector traded taunts.
Various hostile groups taunted Jesus.
Hector called for Deiphobus for help, but he had vanished.
The bystanders thought Jesus called to Elijah for help, but he never came.
Hector then knew that he would be killed, for his gods had abandoned him.
Jesus knew that he would be killed and complained that God had abandoned him.
That parallel is extremely compelling, in my view. Hector's soul went to Hades with a shout.
Jesus uttered a loud shout and expired.
Trojans mourned him as though their city had been destroyed from top to bottom.
At Jesus' death, the curtain of the temple was rent from top to bottom.
Achilles gloated that he had just slain one whom Trojans considered a god.
The centurion gloated that he had just executed a bogus son of God.
The women of Troy, watching Hector's death from their walls, cried laments.
3 women watched Jesus' death from afar and presumably lamented.
So that is the parallel those are the parallels I would draw between the death of Jesus and the death of Hector. Now, I want you, Derek, to go to page 127, and we'll compare the rescue of Jesus's body with the rescue of Hector's corpse. Here we go. Ready?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hector's father, King Priam of Troy, noted for his piety, courageously traveled at night to ask Achilles for the body of his son.
Just so everyone knows, Mark 15:42 through 16:1. Joseph of Arimathea, namesake of Jesus' father, and a distinguished member of the council who himself was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, courageously went at night to ask Pilate for the body of Jesus.
Achilles was amazed at Priam's daring.
Pilate was amazed that Jesus died so quickly.
The gods had protected Hector's body from decay and mutilation.
Jesus' quick death and immediate burial prevented decay and mutilation.
Achilles agreed to the old man's request.
Pilate agreed to Joseph's request.
Slave women anointed and wrapped the corpse for burial, and Achilles placed it on a bier.
Joseph wrapped the corpse for burial and placed it in a tomb. 3 days later, 3 women came to the tomb to anoint the body.
The Trojans covered Hector's grave with large stones.
Joseph rolled a large stone at the door of the tomb.
At the end of the Iliad, the reader knows that Troy is going to fall because its hero is dead. The reader of Mark already knows the temple has been destroyed, and as a divine judgment for not following Jesus and so on. Now, I think those parallels are undeniable. The question really is, with mimesis criticism and its opponents, is this story simply around in the culture? It's the way people would talk about the death of a hero. Or does he have a reason for an imitation of it so that it's better than and not just the same as? So let's run through mimesis criticism as a way of cementing a literary connection between these two and not simply a folkloric or a cultural commonplace. We know that the Iliad was the most popular book in antiquity. And we know that in art, the scene of Priam asking for the body of his son from Achilles was the most replicated image from the Homeric Epics. So it was accessible. We have analogies of imitations. The most famous one I've already mentioned is in Virgil's Aeneid with the death of Turnus. We also have, I think, from what we've seen, parallels that are dense, sequential, and distinctive, especially that awkward thing that has bothered exegetes over and over again. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's what Hector realizes once Deiphobus is not there. Elijah doesn't come either. So you have distinctive traits. What is the interpretability of it? This is not simply a lame imitation. Hector's body stays in a tomb. Jesus's body escapes the tomb. And he is going to be the leader of his crew, his believers, and so on in the future. He's already gone to Galilee, where they are to go and see him. And we can talk about that at some other time. Now, did ancient readers see the similarities between the death of Jesus and the death of Hector? Most probably did not. But we do know that some did. So that what I'm arguing for in the 20th and 21st centuries was seen already at least by the 4th century and as late as the 12th. That is, we have what are called Homerocentones, that is, rewritings of the Gospels in centos or stitchings that are borrowing Homeric lines to retell Gospel stories. This is an early form of Christian poetry. When they retell the story, the death of Jesus, they frequently use lines from the death of Hector in Iliad 22. Please. The Gospel of Nicodemus went through 3 different stages, the last of which probably is anywhere from the 9th to the 12th centuries, has the 3 women at the tomb imitating the laments of Hecuba, Andromache, and Helen. And there can be no doubt whatsoever, because of the density of parallels, that it imitates Priam's rescuing of Hector's corpse from Achilles for narrating Joseph of Arimathea's rescue of Jesus's corpse from Pilate. It's transparent. You can't deny that. Now, whether they thought the gospel authors already had imitated the Iliad or not, I don't know. And I think it's impossible to say. And I suppose one can say reasonably that they didn't see it. But they saw the similarities. And the similarities require some kind of technology of a relationship. And I think the one that makes the most sense and is the least problematic is to say that it's a mimetic connection. Now, next time, because I suppose we're running out of time and I know you still have questions to ask related to this, we'll talk about imitations also in the Odyssey. So Mark is, we'll have a lot of fun with that too. So that's what I would say in introducing mimesis criticism and Mark's concerns about the Logoi of Jesus, why he uses it but tepidly, why he adds the passion narrative, and how he imitates the Iliad in order to do so. So I don't know how we're doing on time, Derek. I'm not watching the tube or the clock, but I'm going to give you a chance to ask them questions. You can speak for the skeptics if you wish to, and then we'll dump some of this over to next time.
Yeah, I think we've got another 15, 20 minutes or so if you want. It's up to you if you have that time. I'd like to just mention, just to kind of clarify, I've heard lots of scholars reject your premise, right, of what you suggest. And the reason why that they do it, and we're going to get into these objections, but I want people to understand before we get into the next episode, how you deal with these objections. And one of them I loved how you did in the fourth gospel, Euripides, the Bacchae, the Dionysian gospel. You really point out, like, they know. So let's say this up front. Let's be all in agreement. They're all agreeing there's something here that is clearly coming from the knowing of these Greek epics. So a lot of these scholars will say Mark definitely has the flavor of the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's the flavor there, but you're going too far. You're creating a genetic connection. You don't need to do that because we don't have a genetic connection. Or they'll say, well, it was in the air, like you said. It's culturally well known. The story was in everyone's head. So subconsciously, when they wrote this narrative, their poetic subconscious kicks in and they know in their air, well, that's a great story. I remember something like that. Jesus must have done that. And then therefore they just write it. But to me, Occam's razor, the way you've presented it in this book and your other books, which is why I highly suggest anyone who's actually interested in parallels and connecting dots and trying to see this, get your writings. You're showing sequential order, which is why you had me read your arguments and the what is mimetic criticism and why it's important. It's one thing to have a parallel. We can make parallels on almost anything, but sequential parallels in order with that many things, it ups the magnitude of the plausibility that something like this is a mimetic or genetic connection. And it seems like they're afraid of going that far. And I don't know why. And maybe we can talk about it and you can give me your thoughts, because I remember you were interviewed on a good buddy of mine, Pine Creek. He has a YouTube channel and he had a special 3-minute clip that he cut. He had to cut it because they asked you, like, what does Dr. Bart Ehrman think of your work? And you go, honestly, I don't know. Like, I don't know if he read it. I don't think he agrees with it. I don't know. But I hear a lot of people who go to Duke University, Chapel Hill and stuff, they're not talking about you or this work. And I really need to get this out there. I think more people need to come out. And if you're critical of it, write your criticisms. I want to see you try to pick apart what Dr. MacDonald's doing or Dennis is doing. And I would be happy to see them try to point out better examples of how what you just read fits better of an Old Testament mimetic connection or something like that. Like, I get the, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Well, Psalms 22, right? We can run there, but how it's being used, I mean, I know it's being borrowed. That phrase is being borrowed from there, but it doesn't sound good on Jesus. Like, this doesn't seem like the deified God who's hanging on a cross, you know? So this is why you come into the human mythologizing him. And we're going to have this debate coming up with Dr. Carrier on this. I suspect some of these things might get discussed. I don't know, but anyway, there wasn't really a question. It's just kind of a comment.
Well, let me respond to several things. First of all, if this stuff was in the air, don't you think somebody would have mentioned it in commentaries before now? So at least give me credit for being the one who's highlighted these parallels, because the parallels are not out there for everybody to recognize. That's the first piece. The second is, at least acknowledge that Homer is all over the place. That's undeniable. And that some people are imitating Homer and some are not. And that Homer influenced the culture generally. There's no doubt about it. You don't have to have a copy of the Iliad in front of you to imitate the death of Hector. I've never argued that you had to. But sometimes people did imitate with the text in front of them, like Virgil, and sometimes they didn't. So what criteria can one use to determine what technology of imitation is at play? Is it generally cultural? Is it literary? Is it directly technologically related from one manuscript to another? But my opponents have never articulated alternative criteria for determining it. So they cut it off immediately. But there are two other aspects to it. One is, if I'm right, almost everything written on the Gospels is wrong. And there is turf protection, not just for individual scholars, but for what I would call the guild. When people go to graduate school or seminaries to be trained in this, they don't encounter mimesis criticism. They encounter Hebrew Bible and Septuagint studies and the history of Judaism, which is valuable and is necessary, but it's not comprehensive of the culture that these people lived in. Another is that there's a temptation to consider the gospel authors and their readers as cultural nincompoops, as not being cultured. They have oral tradition, they write them down. I have a good friend who lives here on the campus where I am, and he says, no, these are all peasants. They can't be reading Homer and so on. Now, how do we know that, apart from the text and what kind of cultural information? So we have, as a guild, made gospel authors and readers far more stupid than they are. We're the ones who are stupid because we're not saturated in their culture in the same way. So we can't see these parallels because we don't know Homer, except for Homer Simpson. So there are a number of. Now, the easiest way, Derek, to argue with somebody is to ignore them. And that's the biggest criticism of my work and the one that's hardest for me to handle. I have never once been in an academic situation where I have had to have a conversation like this and defend mimesis criticism. Now, I can't understand why that is, except that people are fearful of it. And I'm not, so we'll talk more about it next time, about where the explicit criticisms of my work are. But the most dominant criticism gets expressed in avoidance.
So, Dennis, we need to, the only thing I can think of, and we're in a new world. 10 years ago, things weren't the same as they are today. Academic circles are excellent. It's important that they're there, and especially learning from consensus and from brilliant men all over the place. But to get this out there, if it's being avoided in academic circles, sometimes it takes the crowd. It takes what people are interested in to force the academia to consider, okay, we're just going to have to face this Goliath, because if there is an overwhelming consensus in the popularity out here pushing on academia saying, you really need to look into this because there are tens of thousands of people who are looking at this and they're bringing up this idea, let's tackle it. I think that they will follow that. And usually where there's an idea and there's thought, there's money. So a lot of times the academic thought and the schools look at it and say, hey, there's funding involved here. Let's go where we haven't treaded before. So all I ask of you, I have no more questions. I think we need to do another episode and start digging deep into the Odyssey and some of the criticisms you've heard over time, because really it's going to come down to you. I haven't heard many. I just know a lot of people, like an upcoming PhD student. He means no disrespect or anything. But Ian Mills, who's Chapel Hill, I believe it's Chapel Hill or Duke, but he works with Dr. Goodacre and Dr. Ehrman and others. And he said, not many people take his work seriously. So it's not even a thing. Like, they don't think it's valid. They don't even consider it. Why? That's what I thought. And I've even asked other really good friends of mine, do you think that he's right? Do you think that the Markan gospel is borrowing from these things? And they said, I don't know. I'm more of an Old Testament mimetic connection. And I'm like, yeah, that seems to be the most likely, right? Because a lot of people it's easy to go, well, duh, it quotes the Old Testament. It's like constantly pulling from it. But what you're doing, if correct, and I think you are onto something, it is a complete world changer on what these writings are and who they're being written to and why. And there's like, that changes the whole foundation, everything we think we know. So all I ask of you, Dr. MacDonald, is please do more shows with me. And I want to try and set you up with bigger channels that other than myself, to get your name and your work out there, because I think it's important that your work is known in as far as wide as we can get it while you're here, before you have to face Achilles yourself. And then eventually, hopefully you don't get dragged around on a horse, but
yeah, let me respond to a couple of things. One is, first of all, great appreciation for that. The second is, and this is going to feel like quibbling, but I think it's important to say, you talked about lots of brilliant men out there. There are a lot of brilliant women in the field now too. And I know you mean that, and you're not being exclusive.
Apology. Yes.
So, and I think that's a part of the new wave that's important. I'm frustrated that very few women in the field have seen the possibilities of my work to benefit their own work. So that's another piece. One of the things that we've talked about, the academic inertia. And by the way, my students have trouble getting placed because of being tarnished with tainted with my work. And I feel badly about it. I feel awful about it. But it's not a good time for academics to get jobs anyhow because of COVID. But even so, they don't get traction. They do somewhat better in South Korea, by the way, than here. But the other institutions that are problematic are publishers. Publishers don't think that there's a market for this kind of thing because it is so out of the ordinary. So I have some friends who have really encouraged me to go, as we're doing it right now, through digital media and not through publishers, and to make things available as PDFs online where people can have them for themselves in their computers. They can print them out if they want. And I think we are in a sea change now in terms of media and the study of religion. And I think you're one of the people, you and others, are at the forefront of this media shift. Now, unfortunately, the media shift is going to have to include print culture. So the question is, what's that going to look like in the future, where we have, publishers and online publicity like you have? I don't know the answer to it, but I think a lot of the future of discussions like this is going to be online and in the form of digital communication, and not so much the old print culture.
I'd like to say that with your first statement about men, brilliant men, the reason I had even mentioned men as the sex or male figure is because I was actually referring to the people that I've heard respond to me about your work. So yes, you're 100% correct that I actually interview quite a few PhDs on here, and some of them are women, even in New Testament studies, like anti-Judaism or anti-Semitic type concepts in the New Testament or in the book of Acts. Is there anti-Semitic things? There are people who write on these topics that are females, but the people that have engaged me and said to me, hey, that guy, I don't buy what he's saying, or I'm not convinced, are usually all men. I've never heard a female discuss. That's why I mentioned that. So we need to get this out there. If you're watching this and you guys know of a way to help Dr. Dennis MacDonald make this possible, to get this information out there, please let me know. You have my email, mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can help him out by buying the books and constantly getting this information out there. If you know of anyone in particular that has a channel that is interested in exploring these ideas and considering getting this information out there, also let me know. And I can try and get Dr. MacDonald hooked up with them to do shows and to present this to a larger audience. The more people, the merrier. And so I said it before, when I read this book, at the end of this book, I'll tell you, he has his grandson and he's talking to his grandson, and you have to read the boxes. You have to parallel them. You have to really try and explore the mind of Dennis here when he's presenting this, because it's really, really pretty. It's beautiful the way that it's being exposed here in this book, Mythologizing Jesus.
Let me actually retell the story very briefly.
Please do. Yes.
This is not my grandson, it's my son, when he was 13 years old.
Sorry.
Although I did write Mythologizing Jesus for my grandchildren. So you're right about that. My son was 13 years old. He knew I was a professor, and he said, "Dad, what do you teach?" And I said, "Okay, Julian, our bedtime story, I used to read a story to him every night before he went to bed. And I said, for the next 6 nights, I want to lie in bed with you, and I want to tell you 2 stories. I want to tell you one story from Greek epic, Greek poetry, and I want to tell you one from the Gospels about Jesus. And then I just want to talk about them and see what you think." So the first night we talked about some adventure stories of Odysseus. And then I told stories about Jesus and the caveman and the turning soldiers into swine and so on. And I said, "You see the similarities between those?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "Well, what are the differences?" So we talked about those differences. Now we did it the second night, and we did it the third night. We did it the fourth night, fifth night, sixth night. We did it again. And I said, "Julian, I have 2 questions I want to ask you. One is, what should I make of it that almost nobody who reads my work sees these similarities and these strategic differences between the 2 stories?" And he said, "Well, I don't know why." Because my son at 13 saw them. Now I set him up, of course, but still. And then I said, "Which stories do you like better?" He says, "Oh, I love the Greek stories better. They're much more exciting," and so on. And then I said, "Which stories are better to live by?" He said, "Oh, the stories about Jesus, because it's not so violent. It's not." So if that is all I accomplish with this work, is that to see that these authors are ethically engaged with their surroundings and are encouraging people to a more virtuous way of living in the world, then my task has been done.
That is well put. And that was what I was giggling with tears at the end, because it was so well said in light of what you just presented throughout the book. And I just, guys, if you want to know about the Cyclops, if you want to consider like these comparisons and the demonic the demoniac, and I mean, looking at all of them from the calming of the storm, and you name it, even going up onto the Mount of Olives, or the Mount of Transfiguration, if you will, and where is there possibly connections?
We do that next time.
Awesome. So stay tuned. You guys are going to need to stay tuned. Dennis, thank you so much for joining me today on this. Let's get this out there. I'd love to continue talking to you more about this, and let the crowd see what they think. I'd like to hear what you guys think. Comment down below, like this video, share this content out there, get this known, and let me know if you know of someone who would be interested in hearing about these connections. So thank you so much, Dennis.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Don't forget, we are MythVision.